Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we will start our today's seminar discussion and maybe even a conference. I don't know which word fits us best. So good evening, everyone. I'm happy to see you all here. And today we have a special guest with whom we will be able to discuss things related to Europe's eastern neighborhood and probably beyond, because I think we will touch upon many aspects related to international affairs and security, even going beyond the region that is the focus of today's seminar. But anyway, we have a really fantastic guest who came here all the way from France, Nicolas Tenzerio. I will briefly introduce him to you. He is a French civil servant, academic, writer, and editor. He is the chairman of the Center for Studies and Research on Political Decision, which is a think tank in France, and also a publisher of the review La Banquette. He's a guest professor at the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. We've just discussed the subjects that he teaches there. He also teaches in some other institutions in France as well as beyond. He is also a visiting professor in the US, Canada, Serbia, South Korea, Poland, and etc. He's also a guest speaker at many international conferences, mostly on security and international affairs issues, and he's an author of 22 books. Wow, that's fantastic. I really envy your productivity. Since May of this year, he's a publisher of Desk Russie, a bi-monthly newsletter on Russia and the countries of the former Soviet space. He regularly appears in leading newspapers, media outlets, and radio talk shows to discuss the topics that I've recently described. And he writes mostly on issues related with European security issues, Ukraine, Russia, the Middle East, the US foreign policy. I also encourage those who are interested in the topics that I've recently described to take a look at his blog, Tenzer Strategics, where he publishes regularly in English, so it's really a great blog. We enjoy reading it, so I recommend for those who are interested to follow up that as well. So thank you, Nicolas, for coming here today and being with us and discussing those important topics. We will proceed in the following way. I've asked Mr. Tenzer to make a brief introduction, some remarks for the beginning, then we will have a short conversation, and as soon as possible we will try to engage all of you in a discussion. So those who have questions, remarks, or political statements maybe are encouraged to do that, so that this is an interactive seminar rather than just a conversation between us. Okay, so hopefully you will be active participants of that as well. So Nicolas, thanks again. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Linus. Thank you. I don't know if I can take off the mask while speaking. I think it will be certainly easier. Well, thank you. So, dear students, dear friends, it's my pleasure to be here in Vilnius, and I will make some brief introductory remark on the questions of European neighborhoods and especially Russia, because I think that's the key factor of the European questions here is basically what Russia is doing, and I will start with a rather blunt statement, if you allow me. This blunt statement is the following, that Russia so far has won the war. If we consider what Russia did since 21 years, I mean, not Russia as a country, but the regime, Russia's regime, Putin's regime, basically he was able to conduct the war, and we know how he did, in Chechnya. That was the second Chechen war, where a lot of war crimes, slaughters have been committed, and there was a very brief outrage, but then nothing more, because there was the 9/11, and then there was, I think that what Putin did in Chechnya fell into the holes of oblivion, to quote Hannah Arendt. Then there was the war against Georgia, and Putin has seized 20% of the territory of Georgia, as we know. Then there was the war in Syria, and I have to recall that because, in fact, Russia is backing, as we know, the worst criminals against humanity, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, with, of course, its complicit Iran. And there, in fact, Russia has committed more war crimes, killed more Syrian civilians than even ISIS did. And I think we have, certainly, maybe there will be some questions on that, we have to be serious on war crimes. Those crimes are imprescriptible according to the international law, and it means that the perpetrators of war crimes are subject to the International Criminal Court. So we have certainly, I will come back to that, to call a spade and to speak out about what Russia did in Syria. Then, of course, there was Ukraine, 2014, the invasion of Donbass, the illegal annexation of Crimea, where also a lot of crimes against humanity, a lot of persecution and a full crackdown on human rights were committed against the Tatar minority in Crimea. And I could talk also about the support of Putin's Russia to Maduro's regime in Venezuela, to Cuba, and of course we could also mention what Wagner Group did in Syria, but also in Africa, in Mali, in Central Africa, etc. So basically, when I'm saying that Putin has won the war so far, is because there were absolutely not appropriate reactions or retaliations to what Putin did. Of course, there was a lot of sanction, individual sanctions, collective sanctions, individual sanction for Crimea and collective sanction for the non-implementations of the Minsk agreements. That's the legal basis of that. But Putin Russia is continuing relentlessly its aggressions against the democracies, against the liberal values, against the international laws, and is trying to undermine the international organization. Just look at the 16 vetoes on Syria, quite often backed by China, People's Republic of China, more exactly. It means that there is a clear attempt to breach the law. And when it comes to the European neighbourhood, I think we have to take into action that. Of course, we could also mention the meddling, in election in the US and in some European countries, the propaganda, etc. All those things that you perfectly know. It means that when we are talking right now, and many are talking about containment, I think basically containment is not enough. The real questions, not to borrow the Cold War's language, but still, we think we have to speak about rollback. Because if we accept the fait accompli, in Georgia and Ukraine, certainly the things will get worse. I think we have to take into account these things. The second thing that I want to emphasize on is the true question when it comes to Europe and when it comes to what we call geopolitical or geostrategic Europe, is what could the EU do to counter those threats? I think this question is a true question. I am mentioning EU as such because many consider, rightly or wrongly, that for now the US is not completely a reliable partner or a trustworthy partner. We could discuss, of course, these options, but if we consider, for instance, the meeting between President Biden and Putin, if we consider the fact that President Biden finally decided to lift any kind of sanctions on Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and you have also some in the Biden's administration, probably not the majority right now, and certainly Secretary Blinken is opposed to that, who are ready to normalize the relationship with Assad regime. So the real question is what Europe as such could do to deter Russia. And there is then the question, of course, of NATO and how we can combine, I think, NATO approach and Euro as a power if we want really to get serious about that. And I think the question is not only, the questions is not only about the EU countries, but also the non-EU countries. When it comes to the EU countries, let's imagine some scenarios. If you have a major cyber attack on the Baltic states, for instance, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, that completely disable the electric grids. And then all the websites and all the emails of the ministries of defense, presidency, prime minister's office, will get down. With a lot, of course, of propaganda inflating in those countries. Is it enough to trigger the Article 5 of NATO Treaty or not? I think that's a true question, because what's the level of the attack that enables NATO, or NATO's country more exactly, to trigger the Article 5? And if it's not possible, what will the EU do to support the countries? Of course, it's very clear that there will be they will express a very deep concern about Russia, they will blame Russia for that, etc. So we'll have all the empty words, classical words of the diplomatic services, of both the national countries and the UN and other organizations, etc. But what will we do? I think that's the questions. And what are we expecting to do? That's, I think, the first question that we have certainly to assess more gently. Then there is a third question, that's my general introduction, which is the questions of the consistency of Europe, and especially the questions of enlargement. Because many are considering that there is a kind of enlargement fatigue, you know, in the EU circles, not only, the Brussels, but also in the national government, but there is also from some countries an enlargement also, I will say, lassitude, or also a kind of waiting fatigue, more exactly, from those kind of countries. So I think there is absolutely right now no clarity about the true vision of Europe when it comes to the enlargement, because what's at stake? I think what's at stake is the very conception of Europe. Either we consider that Europe is mostly a sort of grant market, that of course the most important thing is the single market, and we have to deepen more and more the economic integrations, to have more and more social laws, more and more environmental laws, which is certainly needed, obviously, or if we consider that we have to attract the countries because we need, as European entity, we have to protect them. Then there is the question, and so there is the question of the borders of Europe. With two questions, sub-questions, I would say. First, the question of the Balkans, Western Balkans more exactly. I think that we have to consider that most of those countries, with the exception of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, are officially recognized as candidate countries, which is good. But the perspective of the enlargement seems to be postponed in a kind of limbo, and I don't know when it could happen. With also some of those countries, mostly Serbia, I must say, also trying to look the other way. Especially Serbia, with a lot of links between the President Vučić, as we know, and his cronies and Putin's regime. Serbia also welcoming a lot of Chinese investments, backing and supporting also the far-right movement. Vučić, for instance, attended some weeks ago the big meeting organized by Orban in Budapest with all the representatives of the far-right movement that are pro-Russian, as we know, in Belgrade. So what are the concrete tools that the EU could have to dissuade Belgrade, for instance, but some other country, to look the other way. Then there is the second question of the enlargement, which is the questions of the countries who are fighting for European values. And two countries, of course, come in mind. First of all, Ukraine, obviously. And I often stated in many of my pieces or talk shows that Ukraine has a full legitimacy to join the club. Because of Maidan, because of the Orange revolutions, and because Ukraine is at the forefront in the fight for European values, with a lot of sacrifice of his soldiers. Then there is the case, and I think that in my view, the path to EU integration for Ukraine is even more important. Even so, I am also backing an MEP to NATO for Ukraine, is even more important than integrations to NATO. Because integrations to NATO could appear to be defensive. Integration for Ukraine to the EU is something which is in a way proactive, and that would show the true resolve of Ukraine to be fully a European country when it comes not only to the values that I was mentioned, there is absolutely no issue on that, but also on the fight against corruptions, I think the upgraded capacities of its economy and social contract, etc. And I think it's very important to have this kind of recognitions. But still, you have some member states of the EU considering that Ukraine is not a European country. And I remember I was in a hearing, in the Senate, French Senate 2 years ago or so, and I had some senators telling me, well, Ukraine is part of Russia, and Crimea is Russian. So you have, and I will come back to that, you have some common places in some European countries, not only my country, but also Germany, but also Italy, but also Portugal, but also Spain, and maybe up to a certain point the Netherlands, Belgium, etc., who considers that Ukraine is not a European country. They know nothing about Ukraine. They know nothing about the specificities, the peculiarities of Ukraine. And I think there is no recognition of the huge contribution of Ukraine to the fight for European values. And there is another country, which is Moldova. And with the election of Maia Sandu in Moldova, and after that the parliamentary elections that gave her a very strong majority in the House, with a very pro-European government, and personally I know well the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Vice Prime Minister of Moldova. I think we have to send clear signal. And I think even the decision of the EU integrations cannot be taken in Moscow. We must stop to have this kind of language. We must not, provoke Russia. No, I think that this kind of language is, I think, very dangerous, and it will be a full renouncement to Europe as a geopolitical power. Then there is a third country. And I think it's very important for me to speak about this country here in Vilnius, which is Belarus. Let's imagine, blue scenarios, optimistic scenario, in which ultimately, I don't know when, I don't know how, well, you will have the current opposition, which is the true government, led by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya or someone else, coming to power in Belarus, with a strong commitment to reform the country, to defend, to promote human rights values, rule of law, democratic values and principles, etc. Why not offer to Belarus the possibility to be a candidate to the EU? I think that's true questions of consistency. Of course, I could be more skeptical about, well, let's say Georgia, Armenia, or even more Azerbaijan for other reasons. But I think we clearly have to define a path based on protection at first and commitment to liberal values. And I think that the second, really the second point that we certainly have to have in consideration. Then, when it comes to EU, I think if we consider the big picture of the EU right now, I would say that the EU is very strongly divided, mostly when it comes to foreign policy and security matters. In fact, there are three steps in the constructions of the EU. The first step, or I will say the first tone, was the economic and financial integrations. There is still a lot to do when it comes, for instance, to a common budget, common rules, economic rules, and when it comes, of course, to the euro, because we know that still some countries are not members of the eurozone. And I think that must be certainly the next path that we have to promote. But I think that globally there is a kind of consensus, even if you have some disputes about, you know, for instance, the COVID-19 rescue plan and this kind of thing. But then there is the second basis, the second stone, which is the European values. We have a lot of disputes right now. And some people are pointing out the responsibility mostly of the Central and Eastern country, which is completely wrong. Because I think if we consider the breach of the rule of law, it's not only about Hungary, and we have a strong Hungarian case, because also, as we know, Orbán is backing Mr. Putin. We have certainly a very strong Polish case for other reasons. But for instance, if we consider all those countries, the corruption in Italy, if we consider, for instance, Nord Stream 2 in Germany and also the kind of corruption in those kind of countries, if we consider the golden passport in Malta and Cyprus, and of course I could enumerate a lot of things. I think we have some common problems also when it comes to the political force in those countries or political strengths of the far-right parties. There is a common problems of all Europe, which is not only, I mean, the fact of the Central and Eastern European countries. But then there is the third point, which is security and foreign policy. I think that's the third stone. And we are still in the beginning, with a lot of contentious visions among the EU member states. I think the first thing that we must have, first of all, is to put in place a kind of mechanism to settle the disputes. And in my view, the best way to do so is to give a kind of priority according to the perceived threats. I mean by that the Eastern and Central European country probably must have a kind of priority or a say more than the others when it comes to Russia and the countries threatened by Russia, namely Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, etc. When it comes, for instance, to the issue related to Turkey or to the different kind of problems that we are facing in North African countries, then probably the countries of the south of the EU should have the priority and a more important say. So we have to, I think, to put in place a kind of mechanism to settle all the disputes. And in any event, I don't think that the French-German couple, or sometimes it is called the French-German directoire or directorate, could have a say on this kind of thing. I think the German-French couple was very useful, very instrumental, you know, in building a consensus on economic issues, on social issues. On foreign policy, I think it must not have this kind of legitimacy. I want to speak very clearly on that, even if it's my country. And let's see what happened, in the last European Council, in June, with the proposal made by France and Germany, mostly Germany, more than France, I must say, and also backed by Austria, on the new dialogue between the EU and Russia. And finally, and hopefully rejected by the other member states of the EU, it was completely misleading. And from this point of view, there is a clear fear. I don't know what will be the next coalition, rather optimistic, because we have the Greens who have a very strong stance on Russia, China, and human rights. But I think it's quite important not to appear for those big countries like France and Germany to be the kind of dividers in chief. Which is right now, I think, one of the main issues that Europe is facing. And then the other thing which could be very important is to appoint a high representative for forensic policy and security. No, that's a kind of joke, as you know. But I think the real problem is that you have no voice. And all the high representatives that we had since Mrs. Ashton, Mrs. Mogherini, and now Mr. Borrell, they don't have the charisma, they don't have the capacity to engage the EU. And that's the result of a true willingness of the major power of the EU not to have a prominent figures holding this position in the EU. And that's a true problem. Because it was a very famous ancient joke about what's the number of telephone of Europe. And right now, the problem is that Mr. Borrell, is not the telephone, and Mr. Michel probably not, and Mrs. von der Leyen not. And to have three heads, I think, is also something which is very, very disturbing. Then there is another point that I want very quickly to emphasize, which is the question of what we call resilience and resistance. I think that, in my view, the question is not the question of the resilience. The question is mostly the question of the resistance. We have really to resist threats. Not only to accept the threats, to have the cyber attack, and to say, okay, we are strong and we are able to counter the threat. We have to resist that. We have also to resist the foreign propaganda. I will give you some ideas about that. And I think it will be a kind of, we have really to change our minds and to change the mindset, to change the software about this question of the so-called resilience. We have to resist, which means very concretely many different things. First of all, I think that we must not, which is very important, we must not solemnly slice the different kind of issues. There is still a tendency in many EU countries to say, well, with China or with Russia, there must be different tracks. Of course, we cannot certainly speak about security, but we could speak of, for instance, the fight against the pandemic or environmental issues, etc. I understand this theoretically, but practically it doesn't work. Because when you engage with this kind of countries, you have the propagandas of those countries coming after that and saying, well, you see, the EU is considering, or the US, could be also for the US, is considering ourselves as legitimate partners. And it will weaken our positions. That's my first point. The second point is that we have certainly to envision to expand and extend the sanctions. We have already the Magnitsky Act, which is good. We have the sanctions that I was mentioning, but we have certainly to have the sanctions on corruption. That's absolutely vital, because if we want really to dissuade Putin's regime, and if we want to create a kind of divide between the oligarchs backing Russia and who basically they have their own wealth, because of the compromises that they made with Russian regime. On the one hand, they are supporting Putin's regime, and on the other hand, of course, they receive a lot of benefits from this support. We have to sanction the oligarchs. There is the Navalny's list with 35 people that, and you perfectly know, I suppose, this list. And I think, no, we have really to enforce which means concretely freezing the assets, ban the travels of the oligarchs and their families to Europe and the UK and the US and Canada and other countries. I think it's quite important to have the lead. And I think the real problem of Europe is that it is not able to have the lead. The US is trying to do so. I don't know up to what point they will go, because you see still, you know, in the US administration some movement to slow down the process, which is really worrying, I must say. But the EU must have the lead. And then there is the third point when it comes to the resistance. First of all, we have to speak out more. We must speak loud and clear about what China is doing. There is still kind of hesitation, I must say, from most of the European leaders, not all of them, to call a spade. And for instance, as I was mentioning before, for instance, to denounce the war crimes committed by Russia in Syria, or by China in the Xinjiang, and the violation of the retrocession agreement, you know, in Hong Kong, with a full crackdown on Hong Kong people, etc. We have to speak loud and clear for which reason? First of all, because we must not be complicit. Second reason is that we have to raise awareness about what Russia and China are doing. If you ask the general public, let's say in France, or in Italy, or in Spain, maybe up to a certain point in Germany, they do not know that there is a war in Ukraine that kills quite every day 3 hours flight from Paris, at the very center of Europe. They do not know that. They do not know about the killing of Syrian civilians. They do not know about the fact that China and Russia are backing the military junta in Burma, etc., etc. There are many other examples that I could give very clearly. And I think we have really to bring awareness, because resilience and mostly resistance is about creating awareness among the general public. Then there is the fourth and last point, which is also we have to protect our democracies from inside. I was talking about corruption. The real issue is that we have a lot of corruption within the EU. I was mentioning the golden passport in Malta and Cyprus. And I could also mention, you know, the former prime minister or ministers of country like Germany, Mr. Schröder, France, Mr. Fillon, you know, Finland, Mr. Haho, Austria, Mrs. Kneissel, but also in the UK, not anymore European countries, Mr. Osborne, working for Russia's subsidiaries. And you have also in those countries a lot of people making consultancies or lobbying or matchmaking for Russia or China or Azerbaijan or Turkey, etc. It's not legally corruption, because it's not defined as corruption. The true problem is that it must be. And we have certainly to expose and to attribute exactly the same for the funding of some think tanks. I know some think tanks in France or in Germany or in Belgium who are basically funded, or in Germany, funded by Russia and China. You have a lot of universities within Europe who are funded by China. And we let the thing as there was absolutely no threat. Just observe what happened in many of the European countries also with the anti-vax movement or anti-sanitary pass, what you call sanitary passport here. We call sanitary pass in France. They are trying to sow discord among those kind of countries with no retaliations. And there is a last threat, which is even more invasive than hard propaganda coming from those networks or Russian-backed or Chinese-backed media, which is what I call soft propaganda. I was mentioning, for instance, in my hearing in the Senate, that you had some senators, not extremists, not coming from the far right nor the radical left, saying, well, basically, Ukraine is Russia. Sometimes many people say, well, even in mainstream leaders, that NATO is not behaving or was not behaving correctly. And saying, well, there is absolutely no difference because we are committing a lot of evil. Just so that what Buddhism, just see what happened when we were, colonial powers. Just see the Vietnam War. Just see the war in Iraq, etc., etc. And they are not perceiving, the threats as they are. They are trying to give some we'll say, circumstances that could explain the behavior of Russia and China. We have to understand Russia, as they say. Definitely not. And then you have also a kind of rosy romanticism, saying, well, Russia is a great nation with a lot of great musicians, painters, writers. Okay, that's true. But Putin's Russia is different of Chekhov's Russia or Mussorgsky's Russia. That's not exactly the same. But you have this kind of romanticism, even for my president, saying, okay, we have to consider the great history of Russia, or, the great history of China, millennial civilization, or the great history of Iran, let's say Persepolis, for instance, a great city, etc. No, I think we have really to consider the specificity, the peculiarity of each regime. And then there is the last point, which is also the question of the Slavs, because I have some things that I know for some good reasons. You have a lot of Russian medias or companies in the UK, in France, in Germany. You have also some Chinese companies suing some persons in those countries, filing lawsuits against them, just to dissuade them, or journalists, activists, human rights organizations, to say the truth about those regimes, without absolutely no concern from the national authorities. Fortunately, you have some in the European Parliament. You have also the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe trying to raise awareness about that. But there is quite nothing in the European countries. And I think that's for the cohesiveness of Europe, for the resistance of Europe against those threats, I think it's a major point too. Sorry, I was maybe a little bit too long, but I wanted just to evoke with you all these kind of questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive overview. I have maybe one only question, and then I'll give the floor to the students, so that we have more time to discuss. This is also an event which is done as a part of conference on the future of Europe. This is a very important initiative supported by, obviously, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, by Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and various other important organizations. So you've mentioned a lot of aspects what Europe should do. And France is in a good position for that, not only because it's one of the most powerful countries in Europe economically and in terms of its population, of course, but also because it's taking over the presidency of the European Union in just a little bit more than 2 months' time. So what do you see in France as the main points of its future European presidency, and how they come together with what you said in terms of security challenges that Europe faces, in terms of Eastern policy of Europe? Is it even being discussed, the things that you mentioned as priorities of the upcoming French presidency?
Well, I think there are different points, basically. First of all, I think there was something very misleading in France's positions that could explain the distrust it faces, was all the discourse about strategic autonomy. I haven't yet discussed this issue, but I think it's the very center, because what France considers, and I think that it will push this idea during the presidency, the fact is that... Oh, sorry, thank you. The fact is that one of the main questions is what Europe could do if the US is not taking action. And I think that if the strategic autonomy means that we have to replace NATO or to replace the Article 5 especially, I think that's a major blunder. That could not happen. But if we consider, let's take a very concrete example. In 2013, when you had in Syria the chemical attacks on the Ghouta, France's president, at that time François Hollande, was ready to take action, just to enforce the red lines that President Obama at that time had decided to draw. But finally, President Obama decided not to go, even if he would have the capacity to do so, and it was not useful to have the support of the Congress. He said, well, we need the support of the Congress at that time. But then after, in some interviews, he recognized that the support of the Congress was absolutely not needed. Then you had the UK, and the House of Commons decided not to go. So France was completely alone, and obviously, even if all the military plans were completely settled, it was not possible for France to go. So one of the main questions for the future, and I think that will be something that will be mentioned in the presidency, what could be the conditions for the EU to take action, not necessarily in Syria, but it could be in Syria or could be in Iraq, could be, and France is doing a lot already, in the Sahel region. And recently, there was the visit of my friend Adomas to Clément Beaune, and I know that Lithuania will help also the new force in Sahel, which is a good thing. Estonia is also doing that, which is a very good thing. So the real question is how to step up our capabilities to take action without the US. So the question of strategic autonomy is not, of course, to replace the US, it cannot be, but, well, to take action if needed, if there is no other opportunity. But let's be very realistic. It's not for now. Maybe in Sahel, yes, because you have a lot of troops, France troops in Sahel, being a very, I must say, a very tragic tribute also to his intervention. I just have to remind of the fact that 90 soldiers, French soldiers were killed in Afghanistan, that more than 60 were killed in Sahel because of the military interventions. And France probably is now the only one country, not only to be a member of the P5 and to be a nuclear power, but also to have this ability to project its military forces abroad. But we have to do more. The question is there a willingness to do so from the other European countries? Some of them certainly, including the Baltic states and Poland, etc. I must say, unfortunately, more hesitant about Germany, even if you have some voices, including before Chancellor Merkel and also Annette Kramp-Karrenbauer, AKK, was also certainly willing to say that. But the problem is that also for the German opinion, and I can understand that very easily, not blaming Germany for that, the perspective to have the coffins of the young soldiers coming back home with a very moving ceremony in Berlin, as we have in France, in the Invalides in France, probably would not be accepted by the public opinion. Because when we are talking about wars, about, I don't know, forever wars, but about wars, it means, of course, a lot of casualties. Casualties especially of the young people of a country. So we have certainly to move forward. I think that the first thing that France will certainly emphasize. Then there are a lot of issues that France will certainly emphasize during the presidency, including the question of the sanitary measures, the question of the rule of law, etc. But I think that there is a better understanding, even if it came in my view too late, and I tried many times to convince Emmanuel Macron on that. I think we have to pay a great deal of attention to what the Eastern and Central European countries think. And I see that Mr. Clément Beaune, or General Minister for European Affairs, visiting a lot of European and Central European countries, which is good, trying to bridge the gap between the different, assessment of the situation. which is good. Well, no, if the real issue is also the following. If we want really to step up dramatically, if we consider that, let's say in 20 years or 30 years, we want to have a strong military capabilities in the EU, able to take action, even in Belarus, or in Ukraine, or in Georgia, or in Armenia or Azerbaijan, it would mean, and we have all the figures, it would mean that we have to spend 5 to 6% of the GDP of each European nations to the military. Which country would accept that? Which government will try to convince his or her public opinion that we should do that? I think that's the true point. But if we want to get serious about that, just see, for instance, what happened to the European Funds of Defense in the last Council. I think the project was to have 6 billion or 7 billion, I don't have all the figures in mind, to found a new defense project. And finally, it was reduced to 1.5 billion. Just see also all the budget devoted to what we call the military mobility. I mean, just to offer the opportunity for the military just to move from one part of Europe to another part of Europe very swiftly in case of threats. And also the budget was reduced from 10 to 1. So you have this kind of debates. You have these debates very vibrant, you know, especially I must say in Germany, but not only.
Thank you. Okay, anyone willing to have a question or remark? Yeah, a couple of hands here, there, and there. Please just wait for the microphone and maybe say a couple of words about yourselves for an introduction.
So I always get the white out, so let me look at the company. Anyway, I'm from Japan. Nice to meet you. Then I'm from Japan. It's great to have a lecture of you. Then, so like as you mentioned, there's the value towards to the soft power instead of physical power. But like even we can see like in this 1 year, China got the conflict with India. So meaning that we still need the like actual power, as you mentioned. Then. So I have one question about like that. Then so can you see the like possibility that there would be like second Gulf War towards to the Russia or those region instead of the Iraq War, because even United States failed the justification of the war itself when it comes to the Iraq war. So would it be possible to like gather every country or even every EU other countries towards to the Russia, because even EU having the pigs country, which is like really poor countries, then I'm just like one simple question: would it be possible, like against to the Russia or those countries?
Thank you. Yeah, would you like to answer now, or we just a couple of questions? Okay. Yeah, please. Then Dorota, please. Yeah, on the. Yeah.
Thank you for your intervention. I had a question about European defense and mostly European defense organization. So in the last 2 months, we've assisted at the one of the biggest failures for France in particular regarding the nuclear submarine deal with Australia. And there's been talks about whether this failure of unilateral diplomacy between France and Australia was not maybe one of the starting point of a more European defense system, because essentially in the AUKUS deals, France was just not seen as a relevant actor at all, just irrelevant actor, quite frankly. So that would be interesting.
Okay, thank you. Maybe let's take the first two for the first round, and then other hands I've seen for the second round.
Yes, okay. When it comes to the AUKUS issue, first of all, we have certainly to agree on the fact that it was very bad manners. And that's not an acceptable behaviors between allies, obviously. That's absolutely certain. And the problem is that basically we can understand Australia up to a certain point, even if we cannot accept, Australian government's behavior, because it considers, rightly or wrongly, that the security will be better defended if there is a very strong deal, whatever the content of the deal, not only the submarines, with the US than with France. Because basically, of course, the US has the capability to project, its maritime powers in the regions, and France could be only a junior partner. That we can understand. But I think the problem is that the AUKUS affair came after many other things. After the withdrawal from Afghanistan, in which the allies were absolutely not consulted by the US on the timing and the way to proceed. It came after the fact that, as I was mentioning before, the US administrations endorsed Mrs. Merkel's claim for Nord Stream 2. Which was perceived as a kind of, let's say, full European behaviors, because it was a kind of separate deal with one of the European countries that didn't take into account the perceptions of the threats or concerns of most of the European countries. So one of the main questions right now is to say, well, first of all, how to try to bridge the gap, and which is very interesting that, of course, France's reactions was very severe. They recall, the French ambassadors to the US and to Australia, not the UK, which was a kind of saying, well, the UK doesn't matter really in this story, but that's another point. But then, no, they are trying to really bridge the gap, to speak frankly about the disagreements, and to find another kind of agreement between the US and the European Union, and not only the US and France. And that's why it was very important that Mrs. von der Leyen and some other European leaders say, okay, we have to rethink the relationship with the US. But then the question is to the what? And then there is basically a question of trust. There is still a question of trust. I was mentioning the very major issue, for instance, if, for instance, you have a new invasion of Ukraine. I mean, major invasion, because you still have, of course, the Russian troops in Ukraine, in Donbass. You still have a lot of skirmishes, but, of course, very deadly skirmishes, actually. And if, for instance, Putin's decided to merge Russia with Belarus, what will the US do? And you know that also Russia is supporting, the new government, pro-Russian government in Georgia. What will the US do? The US was completely absent, and is still completely absent, in the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. And you have a major, something that I was mentioning, footprint of Russia, because of the conflict, even more than before, in both Armenia and Azerbaijan, actually. So there is, you still have, this question. And the AUKUS issue was not I mean, such that important. Of course, it was for France, I mean, individually, but because it was a signal of something else. That's basically the kind of answers that I can give. Maybe if you have some follow-up question, of course, I can answer. Then your question, if I well understood, because it was with the mask, I was not, everything was not perfectly clear, I must say, so please correct me, was basically about what could create a kind of consistency of or cohesiveness between the European nations vis-à-vis mostly the Chinese threat. Was
not even China, the tourists to Russia or China or
oh, maybe if you can just take off your mask for 1 minute, I don't know, because if it's loud.
So the basic question is how even if the Russia or I mean the justification of tours or justification of war towards Russia or China or those like not the democratic countries, I don't think like for example like France or German cannot gather lots of countries like even United States failed at the Iraq War, so how would it be possible to gather all of the country, or even if all of the European Union countries tours to Russia or those countries?
Well, I think it will be very difficult because, of course, the perception, the interest, and also I think the perception of the war itself is completely different, I mean, among the different countries. That was, I was proposing a kind of dispute settlement mechanism. I think we have certainly to have, I'm not saying that we must have a kind of Europe à la carte, but I think there must be some coalitions and a kind of, I will say, accentuated or enhanced legitimacy given to the countries given them concern. For instance, you have more concerns in Europe from the Eastern European and Central European countries about what happened, you know, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Georgia. Okay, you have more concern in the part of the EU about what happened, you know, with the threats coming from Turkey, especially against Cyprus and Greece. And I think we have to create some compromises, saying, okay, we southern countries, we don't care a lot about, you know, what Russia is doing because we don't consider that it's an immediate threat for us, as it is for the Baltic countries and Poland, Finland, Czech Republic, and others. But we accept you to delegate a kind of lead in this kind of issue. And we, Eastern and Central European countries, we understand your concern about Turkey, about, you know, even the terrorist threats coming from, let's say, Libya or other countries, and then we accept that you speak in our names regarding this kind of threats. There will be no common vision, I mean. The real issue is that there will be no common vision. But there are some issues that are completely common. That are common not only to all the EU countries, but common also to all the European zone, with also beyond the EU, which is, for instance, the threats, long-term threats coming from People's Republic of China, with a lot of investment. There will be a piece that will be released very shortly about, for instance, the fact that you have increasing Chinese investment in Ukraine. And you had a kind of new agreements between President Zelensky and Chinese government of Belt and Road Initiative, for instance. And you had a lot of more purchase by Chinese of Ukraine's wheat, which is also a true issue in terms of European food security. And we have also this main issue of the influence coming from Russia, but also China and Turkey in the Balkans regions. So I think we have to create this kind of compromise. It's not saying that each nation has to be at war and participate to a kind of war of course, that we must prevent certainly, you know, of the other European countries.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Tenzer, for coming and sharing your thoughts. As you noted, France and Germany has an important role in Europe's position regarding Russia, but right now Germany's position vis-à-vis Russia is unclear due to the Nord Stream 2 and the changement in the government. France next year will have presidential elections with potentially new president coming. So how these changes will affect the national positions of both countries vis-à-vis Russia, and how they will affect, in general, EU relations with Russia. And the last question is how we should avoid another shameful visit of Borrell to Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just one
yes,
more?
Yes, please.
Yeah, on this side, yeah.
So I'm from Hungary. It was really interesting to hear this lecture because in Hungary we have a totally different opinion about Russia, and I think you already know this. And actually my question is really connected to this. Don't you think like a fastened Ukrainian European Union membership could really affect the European unity? I mean, if you think about the case of Hungary, Poland, and mostly the Eastern European countries, Western Europe didn't really, I mean, they wasn't able to really make the European values alive in these countries. And also, it's a really big problem in Hungary and Poland. European monies just institutionalize the corruption and also like just strengthen the incumbent governmental power. And don't you think like if a state like Ukraine, which already have a big problem with corruption, oligarchs, and kind of a failed state, like it could be just really demolish the European unity? And also, don't you think like maybe this Ukrainian European membership could causing in the end like a Trojan horse for the Russians in the European Commission and the European Parliament, if like there is a big governmental change in the Ukrainian politics, which could every time happen, I think, according to the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you both for your, I think, very, very insightful questions. When it comes, first of all, to the possible change in German and French policy vis-à-vis Russia, well, first of all, when it comes to Germany, we certainly have to wait for the coalition agreement between the SPD, the FDP, and the Grünen. Because basically on Russia, those three parties do not agree. You have in the SPD a very traditional, I would say, appeasement stance towards Russia, obviously, embodied not only by Mr. Schröder, but also by President Steinmeier, especially when he was Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You have the traditional, I will say, rather, I will say, soft position in the apparatus of the SPD, even if you have also within the SPD, to some of them, some dissenting voices. But it's true that's difficult. FDP is more divided, but basically FDP is a liberal party and completely liberal also when it comes to the economy, the social issues, and also foreign policy. And you have some changes in the leadership of the FDP recently that could, I think, inaugurate a more tougher stance vis-à-vis Russia. And the Green, we perfectly know the position. Basically very consistent on human rights, Russia, China, and dictatorships in general. So finally, what will be, I mean, the compromise? And we will see, because you know that the coalition agreement in Germany is a very long document, more than 100 pages document, and we will see what will be, you know, in this document. There is, in my view, very unlikely that the SPD will accept to cancel and to close down Nord Stream 2. But probably there will be more guarantees. I am not that confident also that probably the Grünen will renounce to their very strong stance vis-à-vis China and especially the CEI, which is certainly not acceptable. But when it comes to Russia, I think there will be a kind of more balanced position. When it comes to France, I think it's very paradoxical in France. Of course, I don't know if Mr. Macron will be re-elected or not. No one can predict anything. I can explain you the pros and the contra if you like, what the different hypotheses that we could have. We have very unfortunately, and I am very ashamed of that, a very strong far right, you know, in France, and you know that the far right in France, like all the other far right movement everywhere in Europe, are very pro-Putin. That we know, but you have also the classical conservative party, the Republicans, les Républicains in French, who is also a majority of the members of the Républicains is also, I would say, for a kind of appeasement with Putin's Russia. And you had one of the likely candidates for running for the Republican Party, Xavier Bertrand, in France, saying, well, we have to engage with Russia and China. The only one who are really very consistent on human rights, Russia, China, etc., in France, they are the Socialist Party and the Green Party. They are, for instance, the candidate of the Socialist Party, Anne Hidalgo, she received Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya in Paris. Yesterday, unfortunately, I was here, so I was not able to participate to the event. There was a very strong tribute and warm tribute to Anna Politkovskaya on her anniversary, on the anniversary of her death or assassination. And also in this there was a ceremony, and some of the text published by Navalny in my own, journal, Des Cruci, were read in public in the town hall by a very famous French actor, Amalric. So you and the Green Party, since the beginning, Yannick Jadot, the Green candidate, also denounced very often the crackdown on human rights in China, in Russia, etc. So, but the problem is, first of all, that the classical left, not talking about the far left, because the far left is very much pro-Putin, also Mélenchon, I mean. But the classical left, moderate left, Green and Socialist, the problem is that according to the opinion survey, first of all, they are divided, but according to the socialist, the last opinion survey, the Socialist candidate will make probably 6 or 7%, and the Green candidate 7 or 8%, which is not enough to go to the second round. So, in a view, Macron appears to be, if or not re-elected, appears to be a kind of, let's say, centrist candidate when it comes to Russia. Because on the one hand, he was backing Germany in the initiative of the dialogue. You have a lot of dialogue with Russia going on, a lot of working group with Russia that lead absolutely nowhere, I must say. But you still have the groups. But still, Macron is always supporting the sanctions against Russia. And I have some insight from that. All the private discussions that Macron had through video conference with Mr. Putin, he was very strong. So I think it's a kind of very balanced, it was one of the slogans of Macron campaign in 2017, which was en même temps, at the same time, simultaneously. And when it comes to Russia, Macron is more ambiguous. But from this point of view, probably the best, if we want a strong stance vis-à-vis Russia, will be socialist and green. Macron is in between, and the worst will be far right and the conservative. That's all. So we'll see what happens and what will be also the dynamic of the German-French couple. One of the issues is that Macron is speaking loud and clear about Europe. He's a pro-European, even if we may disagree about his conception of Europe. And the problem is that you don't have nowadays any other strong leaders expressing strongly in a lot of speeches, text, interviews, a comprehensive view of Europe. So we may disagree with Emmanuel Macron, and certainly I do, even I know him since more than 15 years, and expressed directly to him sometimes. But the problem is that you don't have anyone else giving a strong vision of Europe. And I think that's a true problem for Europe right now. It's another story, but still. So your questions, when it comes to Ukraine's membership, could it be a kind of Trojan horse? Could it create even more corruption in Europe? Well, first of all, if we consider Ukraine membership, first of all, or Serbia's membership, or any other country membership, if it happens, it will happen, or it would happen in 15 or 20 years from now. So I cannot predict what will be Ukraine in 20 years from now. And there could be a path to EU integrations, and ultimately, at the end of the day, if Ukraine is not meeting the criteria, it won't be a member. And what I think, because we learned a lot from not only Hungary, Poland, but let's say also Bulgaria, Romania, Cyprus, Malta, Austria, where you have a lot of corruption, not to mention Italy up to a certain extent. There will be certainly stronger conditionality for the new entrants, especially when it comes to corruption and the respect of the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, the free media, and all these kind of very needed things and needed principles. That's, I think, the first thing. Then there is another objection that I am often hear, especially coming from very sincere pro-European people in Europe. The most we enlarge, the less we deepen. The most we enlarge, the less will be the economic, social, and also, let's say, value-based integrations. The problem is, and the most we enlarge, the less there will be a chance to have a kind of federal Europe. But let's be very clear, there won't be a federal Europe. We may regret it, we may consider that it is a missed opportunity, but with already 27 member states being member of the club, that's the end of any idea of a federal Europe. Not saying that there are not some federal dimensions of the European constructions, including the single market, the Eurozones, there could be some others. Of course, the precedence of the European law on the national law, which is, in my view, a very important principle. That's something that I said 2 weeks ago when I was in Warsaw to my Polish friends. That's a principle, and also you have a lot of debate in France going on, and also in Germany with the ruling of the Karlsruhe jurisdictions. That's a very important principle. So if we have 31 instead of 27 or 33 or 34, will it really change the very nature of Europe? And right now, you are perfectly right. Corruption in Ukraine is a major problem. The role of the oligarch is a major problem. And I think that Ukraine's government Ukraine's parliament even more, are not serious about that. There must be more pressures. I was mentioning the deal with China, which is absolutely unacceptable because that's also a factor of corruption, because we know how the Chinese behave, like the Russians. But I think we have, if we want to be serious on that, that was exactly what I was saying about Serbia. We have to put in place a very strong conditionality when it comes not only to corruption, rule of law, but also when it comes to foreign alliances. We cannot accept that there will be, as you rightly said, Trojan horses in Europe. Could be Chinese Trojan horses, could be Turkish Trojan horses, could be Russian Trojan horses. So we must have more credibility, we must have more conditionality, and I think that must be a next step that we have to figure out and to put in place, which is conditionality on the foreign alliances.
Thank you, and I think we have time for one last more. Anyone? Yeah, please.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. And I have a question related to European Union's attitude towards China, and you have already mentioned that before, and you've mentioned also that probably it will depend a lot on the future coalition in Germany and the new president in France. But I'd like to ask about the French presidency of the European Union, which is starting soon, and what will be its attitude towards the current European Union's strategy towards China, meaning that China is at the same time a cooperation partner, a rival, and also a competitor. But also we have to bear in mind these different opinions regarding the CEI agreement, which has been suspended, so to say, or is still waiting ratification. So what will be the French presidency's position on developing future relations with China, also bearing in mind its growing assertiveness and possibility of making a certain partnership with Russia in the negative sense for Europe? Thank you.
Well, I think it's a very, of course, a very difficult questions, because the real issue, I think in the long run, is to lower the dependency of the EU country to People's Republic of China. I mean, in terms of goods, in terms of technology, and I think I wrote a piece recently on that. I think that the project of Digital Services Act is not serious enough about the technological threats coming from China. And I think we are only considering, for instance, what we call the GAFAM. I mean, the giant American tech. Not only, not enough, Huawei, Tencent, and also Alibaba, and other groups, in People's Republic of China. That's, I think, the first thing. So we have to lower the dependency. And when it comes to what we call strategic autonomy, I think it's very important to build something like a kind of technological strategic autonomy. Then we have also, and I think that's also a German problem, more than a French problem. We have to reduce, we'll say, not to be too tough, but export addictions of Germany. And the trade between Germany and China is, I think, 3 times more, 4 times more than the trade between France and China. So it creates dependency, and I think that's the true issue in the right now, is to limit that. But this dependency has also an advantage, because I must say, very genuinely, if I was certainly not backing the CII, certainly, and I think it was very wrong and very damaging. But I must say that Chancellor Merkel was speaking loud and clear about, what happened in Xinjiang. She met frequently with the Dalai Lama because she perfectly knew that because of this dependency, China also needs some of the German goods. So, well, I think it's important to have also this kind of balanced views. Then, when it comes, because we were mentioning just before, there was a question on AUKUS, I think that Europe, and especially France, could participate also to the protection of our allies, in Asia, and I think the main threat there is China, and France is certainly aware of the threats. France, if you read, for instance, what Macron said, in the interview, two interviews with The Economist and with the FT, he is very strong on China, even if, in my view, it was not enough when it comes to Hong Kong. So I think we have, first of all, to reduce this kind of dependency. We have to speak out on the human rights issues. We have to step up our military capabilities in Eastern Asia and protect more our allies, in the Indo-Pacific regions. That's absolutely, certainly, that we should do. And there was a very important report, soon to be translated into English, so you will be able to read it, not only in French, 620-page report, coming from the Institute of Research of the Military School in France, that was denouncing, exposing very clearly, in very much details, all the Chinese propaganda in Europe. And I think we have certainly to expose, we have to deter the Chinese propaganda the same way we have to deter, the Russian propaganda, exactly the same. For instance, we have certainly we must not accept, for instance, the financing of think tanks and universities by the Chinese companies and Chinese state. Just to give you an example, there was a meeting of the German CDU, I don't remember in which part of Germany, and you had a lot of placards like this, not Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, but instead of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, it was mentioned Huawei Germany. So, not acceptable. I think so. We must have some rules. Right now it's legal, but we have certainly, as I said before, we have to increase the protection laws against the financing of Russia and other foreign states, not only China and Russia, in fact. When it comes to the New Deal with Russia, well, I think there will be no deal with Russia. I mean, with Putin regime, not talking with Russia. Certainly, it will be, I think, the interest of the Russian people to have, clear cooperation with Europe, to decrease, all the spendings on disinformation and military. But that will be for, I don't know, I hope to still see it, and I hope that you will see it, free and democratic Russia.
Thank you for that, and thank you for mentioning this 620 pages report. I'll think about making it compulsory reading for my class. I think students will certainly enjoy doing this. But an easier task for all of you, or maybe an ask from my side, there is a short questionnaire on issues related to European Union policy, a very topical one in terms of discussion that we've just had. So please, those who are able, just spend 2 or 3 minutes filling it, and we would be very grateful for that. And now I would like to thank Mr. Nicolas Tenzerio for coming here today and sharing his thoughts. A round of applause for our guest. And hopefully not the last time.